Not gonna miss a word this time, huh?
Not one single word. How are you, Tyler?
I am so much better.
You even sound better. You look a little bit better. So yeah, great to see you again, man.
Yeah. No, I was hurting like the top of my mouth. I don't know. It was just weird. Like the top of my mouth was swollen. Like I got a bee sting. It was a weird, painful sore throat.
Just so everybody knows what we're talking about, we're doing this a week later than we planned, or almost a week later than we planned, because Tyler wasn't feeling well. We had the room in the schedule, so we just went ahead and moved back a week. So, well, welcome to the show. It's great to have you. Why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about Tyler and where you're at?
Uh sure. So I'm Tyler. We're Big Bluff Ranch. We are physically where we are at. We are in Northern California, so we're about 2 hours north of Sacramento. We're in the Sacramento Valley. We are just outside of the fertile grounds of where all the walnuts and prunes and almonds are grown, and we're not all the way up into the timber country where all the other fortunes are made. So we're right there in the middle of no man's land. And we've been here since about 1960. Grandpa bought the ranch then, and we've been kind of on an organic, regenerative, holistic management journey since the early 80s. My dad went to a conference with Alan Savory back in
Like
early 80s, back when he was
83,
still.
84, I think is when he was 82, 83, 84. I think is when he was around the West and the Southwest.
Yep. My dad saw him right there at the very beginning. So I would have been, I don't know, fourth, fifth grade, something like that when he saw him. And so essentially that's all I've ever kind of known is how we've done that. And we've just been going farther and farther down that path. So we built lots of fences and put in lots of water troughs and water points. And we actually did do the mythical double your carrying capacity for the ranch, which was pretty fun. So bought another ranch for free or whatever kind of the fun saying is. Then that led us in the 90s to messing around with genetics, our beef genetics. So we started buying bulls from the Hatfields, Doc and Connie Hatfield, who were the founding members of Oregon. I think they're Oregon Country Beef at the time, and now they're Oregon Natural Beef. It doesn't really matter, but they were short wide cows, and we started messing around with that and got pretty decent genetics for grass fed beef. Not really needing to, but we were trying to get low supplement on our cows. We were going for the least cost production, so we didn't want to buy winter hay. We didn't want to buy supplements that we didn't have to. So we were trying to fit the genetics to our environment.
Well, that only
And
makes sense.
right, yeah, it was just cows, grass, water. If you're kind of adding all that much more to that equation, you're probably making it harder than it needs to be. Um,
I would agree.
we, yeah. Then we tried to. Well, then Michael Pollen wrote an article in 2000 or 1999, 2000 called Power Steer in the New Yorker, I believe it was. And that really was the beginning of the grass-fed beef movement. People knew about it before then, but he really blew it up where he followed the life of one steer from weaning through backgrounding. I don't remember exactly what, through the feedlot and the processing plant, and freaked out a lot of people about that process. And this is when a lot of people are like, hey, and at the end of it, his alternative was a grass-fed beef. He bought a steer from someone and put it in his freezer and was like, "Oh, this is amazing." And
And
so that,
let's be
that
honest. If the general public knew everything that happened to that steer after it left the pasture, between the pasture and the plate, that's why veganism is winning. Like
right,
let's be real. That's why they're winning is because of the production practices, not just in feedlots, but in hog and chicken barns too.
right, right, yeah. It's no, no one wants to know how the sausage is made. All they want to do is eat it.
Right.
So anyways, we started doing grass-fed beef. I was at farmers markets with our grass-fed beef in the 2000s. We tried grass-fed lamb, grass-fed goat, which was great from a production standpoint because we have lots of hills and we have lots of brush, but not many people eat it, and they are a full-time management deal. Like, you don't kind of passively raise those guys. You're paying attention to them a lot, and we didn't have the capacity to raise them the way we should. So we got out of those guys. We tried a little bit of chicken, and we did a good job by the chicken, but we ended up hand processing them, scalding them over the kitchen sink, so you had the wet chicken feather smell, wet chicken manure smell in the house. So my mom was like, no,
everybody loves chickens until it's processing day.
Exactly. So we're like, okay, new rule, 4 legs only. So we we got out of chickens, and we're like, well, the only thing left is pork, right? So we went into pastured pork. Well, not knowing what we didn't know that we did know we had a lot of wild pigs around, but we didn't know that wild pigs, you can train pigs to electric fence. I absolutely don't deny that. But when you get a wild boar who backs up about 50 yards away, goes at a full sprint to like zip through that electric fence to get your domestic sow in heat, like it doesn't really matter.
There's not a whole lot that's going to hold that back.
No. So our domestic pig program was just basically half wild pig. So that
probably didn't turn out well.
No, it really didn't.
I can imagine.
Really didn't. The genetics were weird. Their personalities were weird. So anyways, got out of pigs, and we're like, well, let's get back. What do we get back into? Everyone else was around with beef. No, still is the case today. No one is valuing the beef correctly. So you're just like, there's no way you're making money at this price. You are losing money. But no, they don't even know that. So anyways, the only thing that was left was chickens. And we're like, well, no one's dumb enough to do chickens. We're kind of dumb. So let's do some chickens. So we got into it. We got up to about 1,800 head a year processing on farm, reached a point where no one would answer their phone anymore when it was time to process them. Kind of like you just said, processing chickens. Everyone loves it until you start processing them. So then I went to a conference, ran into a guy who could sell more than he could raise, and I could raise more than I could sell. And that was pretty much when we flipped the switch over towards a contract growing situation where we were growing for someone else and they would put their label on it and distribute it out around through the Bay Area, which is about 4 hours away from us. And that was what we've done for the past 12-ish years, 13-ish years, until COVID kind of blew that all kaboom. And we've built
kaboom in a good or kaboom in a bad?
Actually, it was kind of both at the same time. Okay. First, it was a bad kaboom. So our big 10-year-old contract went away. But then it went kaboom in a good way because we picked up another contract without missing a harvest, which was just unbelievable. They wanted more chicken for more money. And we're like, whoa, all right. And but then they went kaboom. So it was kind of a topsy-turvy turn. So we've built back some of our wholesale business, but the wholesale world has changed since we kind of first got started. So we're trying to get a direct-to-consumer program up and going. So that's kind of my big thing these days is we've got the wholesale stuff chunking along in the background. If it gets better, that'd be great. But really, we're trying to go back to our roots of direct to consumer and, capture that whole dollar, and even above and beyond the dollar, just to talk to the people about what we're doing, right? That it is perfectly pleasant to just ship your animals off to the slaughterhouse and get a nice big check. But there is something intangible about like having someone say, I haven't had a chicken that good since my grandma made it for me when I was 5 years old. That's pretty fun to get that sort of feedback. So can't really put a dollar on it, but it's definitely worth going after.
Or when somebody says, man, this is what I remember steak tasting like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm doing something right. You know, so you said that you're contract growing chickens, and for some reason that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up because I've read Meat Racket, I've read Wastelands, and it's Meat Racket is about how Tyson took over the chicken industry, and Wastelands is about how pork run off, how waste from hog, primarily hog, but also to some extent chicken farms in big confinement barns affect their neighbors in North Carolina. And Wastelands was talking about some lawsuits. And I don't think big cattle feedlots are any different. Don't know how many y'all or Tyler, if you've ever like driven through the Texas and Oklahoma Panhandle, Southwest Kansas. Those I've never been. I've never driven past a feedlot and gone, oh man, what a nice place. That smells good. You know, that looks like it's such a good environment to live in. I've never driven past one and thought that.
No.
So maybe do you understand what I'm talking about when I have like some kind of red flags when I hear contract
Right.
growing chickens? Can you maybe explain how that's not the situation you're in, like with a Tyson or a Smithfield or something like that?
No, yeah. So when I say I get my business terms mixed up, right? I'm a yo-yo raising chicken. So in my mind, a contract is where I'm growing a product, someone else is putting their label on it and selling it on. So they could have also been buying from another pasture poultry guy, commingling our production, putting the same label on it, moving it on down the value chain. So in my mind, that's a contract. The buyer and I would sit down yearly and be like, okay, how many had delivered for what month for what dollar.
I suppose the difference would be like one of the big chicken houses that they would provide you the birds.
Mm-hmm.
They would tell you what to feed them. They would sell you the feed. They would have their flock health consultant come out and inspect your facilities. Is it something like that, or are you more making the call of what birds you're going to buy, how you're going to feed them, and you just deliver them?
Yeah, well, we it was I call it contract growing. You're actually the only person who's ever called me out on it. So
I'm not
good
calling
on
you
you.
out. I'm
We
just
are
trying to
not
be
we are
fair.
not when I say chicken contract, I am not at all anything at all like what Purdue does. We're not, or Tyson or whoever. We're not in a tournament system. We're not doing anything. This is a contracted out growing arrangement, much more like if you were to bring on a set of stockers where you're like, hey, they're coming on at this weight. We're going to pay this much gain, and they're going to come off at this date. And this is the contracted agreement to how we get paid. So it's when I say contract, it's much more that the guy and I sat down, figured out the parameters of what he wanted, volume, weight, deliverables, and then I said, okay, well, this is the price I need to hit those deliverables, and then we signed the contract and we went on from there. So no, the conventional guys do, those farmers, I mean, it's pretty horrible. They're like in serfs, or it's, I don't even understand how people are
It's
still doing
hard.
that.
It's hard for me to call that contract growing. Like, okay, in my mind, it's kind of what you said. I take them in by the head, by the day, or on gain rate or whatever, and get paid on pounds or animals delivered and days they were here. And I guess that's kind of still the model in a hog or a chicken barn. But when the big company, I don't really want to get sued, which I might someday, but well, fuck it, Tyson. So let's just say Tyson, because there's already been a book written about it. They provide you the birds, they provide the feed, they provide the veterinary technical assistance. They got a guy that shows up once a week to tell you how to run your barn, and you're there
Right.
every day. And then they tell you when they're going to drop them off, when they're going to pick them up. Like, so what is, in that case, like, what is the farmer's actual responsibility past making sure those birds stay alive for 3 months and there's as many of them as possible? It's not, it's not a good production model that gives any sort of thought to the actual welfare of the animals, what kind of, how they're living, or really the welfare of the workers that have to work there.
Yeah, no, it's not good. I would say that the economic incentive is for a cheap protein source, and that I am actually very far removed from that world, but I could see how if the economic incentive is changed to something else, like for instance, the chicken industry has reduced their antibiotic use by some large percentage, and that is all driven by consumers, that somehow the consumers like, I don't want super bugs, no more sub therapeutic or antibiotic use, and the big chicken companies didn't really want to go down that route because it's easier when you can crack open some antibiotics and you're good to go. But that the consumer demand was so strong, and is still so strong, that they are having to figure out how to go antibiotic free, not because they want to, but because that's what the market is compelling them to. So there are ways where I mean, I don't know the answer, but I can see that if you had an economic incentive different than what there is out there now, that this tournament system could, which is what they call it. So when they harvest all of the barns at the same time, and that each grower is graded against each other. So some are above average, some are below average, and depending on where you rank, you actually will make a little bit more or make a little bit less money. Not 100% sure how it works, but you are being graded and compared and competitive, incentivized against your compatriots here. And that sort of, and they need every penny they get. So they're extremely motivated to do these sort of things. So if you make the goal different and they get paid an extra penny a pound to do, I don't know what the goal would be, but that whole tournament system is good. It could be used for good instead of evil. But there's no one driving that. There's no incentive for that right now.
You hit on something about, cheap protein and cheap food, and I've been thinking a lot the last month about the economics of food production and labor versus inflation and land acquisition cost and other input costs. It's really difficult to kind of square agricultural production in a large part of the country because of the high land cost and input cost. Oh man, wow, what the hell was I going with that? Uh, and they're only getting worse. I and I said it on Just Nad's podcast the other day. I can raise the question: have we reached peak Earl Butts? Like, have we reached the peak of get big or get out, where there's very little room to grow bigger anymore and take on more debt? That it's time for some of these operations to start maybe shedding off pieces to and give a younger operator an opportunity to start up. You don't.
I would certainly like to think so, but that does not at all seem to be the trend for all the big operations I see around here. So down in the valley from us, that our part of Sacramento Valley, the actual fertile part of the Sacramento Valley, is just going into tree crops left and right, and that they're only getting bigger. There's not more mom and pops starting up. What's happening is the mom and pops started up 20 years ago, and their 10 to 20 acres of walnuts aren't big enough, and so they sell out to someone else who has 5,000 acres. And it just happens all the time. You drive down the road and come down the road again a year later, like, oh look, it's now owned by Crane, or now it's owned by whoever. And it's just, to me, it feels like the consolidation is still happening, and that it feels like that what's happening is that if you are an innovative, driven, young agricultural person, that if you want to operate at any scale, you got to work for these big guys, and they'll give you a production unit or something like that. And within the umbrella, you can innovate. I'm not saying that that's the good way, but that's the way it feels like it's happening right now.
And I can see that. What's more valuable, the walnut crop or the long-term water rights that are guaranteed by having a tree that takes 30 years to grow?
The Well, in California, your water rights are probably more valuable, but you get those whether or not you have something in the ground. So and this is actually what my wife does somewhat professionally. She is a water engineer. She knows all of the water rights stuff. We are well outside of all of that sort of California Central Valley project stuff. So I don't deal with any of the irrigation districts or anything like that. I watch it from a distance and go like, oh man, that's crazy.
We
But
could
yeah, you
probably
have
talk
different
about
tier.
water rights for 2 hours a day every week for a year, and nobody would still understand it.
And it's probably true. So, so yeah, so it is silly to be putting in so many permanent crops in California with the way the water rights are structured and with the way the water's falling out of the sky. That when you get down south of the Delta, down into the Central Valley, San Joaquin Valley, that I don't quite see how that's all going to play out in the long run. I mean, they're already having to lay off thousands and thousands of acres have gone fallow, and they're trying to just limp these poor trees along. And it's, and then there's all this, California is just starting to regulate groundwater usage. So somewhere down south, they're talking about subsidence where the ground is literally collapsed feet, 4, 5, 6 feet. And that's basically all of your air pockets that were full of water that became air collapsed. And you now can never restore water back into that aquifer again because it's gone. It's solid now. There's no, so it's a little hairy, really. Yeah. And then you have the whole urban versus rural argument about, who deserves the water. So rural people are pissed at urban people and urban people are pissed at rural people. And it's like, well, we need to grow food, people. You got to admit that. And hey, city people need to, take showers. I don't know what the answer is there, but it is, you can see the strain happening that the California water system, from my very inexpert standpoint, is starting to show the strain. Because this was all set up back when we actually had more water. And if you look at these really long range climate stuff, as long as Europeans have been in California, we've actually been here in a wet period, and
Right.
that we are coming out of this wet period into a more historically average dry period. And that's so all of these systems that we have in place are based on the assumption of water at a higher level than we probably really should be expecting. So yeah, over the next 30, 40, 50 years, there could be some pretty cataclysmic stuff going on here in California agriculture.
And, you know, it, just for reference, you're in Northern California, so it's kind of like a different, water situation and irrigation scheme than the one that's like kind of really fixed in the front of my mind right now, which is what's happening in Lower Colorado with Lake Mead and Lake Powell. And the 30,000-foot view of it is of all I think this number just applies to the Colorado River Basin, but something like 80% of the water in the Colorado River Basin goes for agriculture. Okay, yeah, we got to eat. We got to eat. We got to grow food. Um, but people are realizing that there's a large part of that goes to grow corn, goes to grow alfalfa, and like there's a significant number of alfalfa acres that account for a lot of water usage. And that alfalfa and that land is owned by Saudi Arabian corporations. And they load that alfalfa onto airplanes and they fly it to Saudi Arabia to feed to their racehorses. Like, you know, I'm complaining about $270 a ton alfalfa hay. Like, I can't imagine what the freight is on it to fly it from Arizona, New Mexico, Arizona and Nevada to freaking Saudi Arabia. That's got to be absurd.
And
So
they never even look at the bill, man.
I know. It's like they just laugh when they're putting their own fuel into the tanks of the airplane, I'm sure. But I think about things like that, and I remember, I kind of remember like in 80s and 90s when I was a kid, and we grew up about the same time. they didn't allow foreign nationals, they didn't allow foreign companies to own farmland. Like that wasn't a thing. I don't think it was. Maybe I'm wrong. It we touched on cheap food earlier. Like that's one of the functions of government. That's one of the prime functions of government. Like to ensure that the people can eat and that food is plentiful and cheap to allow for growth. I mean, if we don't have cheap, plentiful food at the bottom, at the as the bedrock of the economic pyramid, the whole thing's on a shaky house of cards. Um, so there's problems in agriculture. Like, we talked about just a few minutes ago, with feedlots and chicken barns and hog barns being kind of representing what I feel some of the worst of the industry and some of the worst animal husbandry practices that we can even dream up. They don't want to know how the sausage is made. They don't want to know how the bacon's made. They just want it all to cost $1. I can remember not too many years ago, my wife went to the store and brought home like a bag of chicken, like a 2 or 3 pound bag of chicken for $2, $3. It was like $1 a pound. And now we sit back and we think about that and we go, how many people are exploited for that $1.99 a pound chicken? How many people get exploited for that, 99-cent cheeseburger? How much environmental destruction and how many externalized costs are behind that? So,
a lot,
all of them. So let's wrap that back to your chickens, because that's where we were. We were talking about how you raise your chickens.
Right. So yeah, we're pasture raised. So that means we have no permanent buildings on the ranch except for the ones we live in, humans. So we do so I don't know. I don't quite know how to put it together, but that the conventional guys right now, their main directive is cheap, right? Their whole thing is cheap production. So we, as a pasture poultry person, we are not trying to get away from cheap production, right? We have to be as reasonably effective as possible, but we just want to pair it with one other thing. And I think what I'm going to, I'm going to talk my way through this theory. So I don't know if I'm picking the right term to start off with, but something about like health, like animal health, land health, just health in general, financial health for the ranch. And so as soon as you pair this additional concept to cheap, it changes your whole production system. And so that, this audience probably has a little better sense than some of the other ones that I talked to. Joel Salatin wrote Pasture Profits, sometime in the 90s. And he was, yeah, that's right. You're going to talk to him next week. So yeah, so anyways, he wrote the book. I mean, and that really started the whole movement, right? And so that's where we started off with. We had our chicks and we moved them daily, and just based on our environment, between our temperature and our geography of our pasture, we ended up moving more toward a day range model, which means that we set up hoops for the life of the flock. And the older they get, the farther they walk away from their hoops to get their fresh pasture, and then they come back.
You don't harvest you don't move the hoops like a chicken tractor?
Not daily.
Okay.
Nope. So, because we tried it. It's too hot. We couldn't build a hoop that would keep the birds from not baking. And then we have creeks and hills and stuff like that. So the day move just never worked for us. So we kind of developed off of the day range model, which kind of was talked about by a guy named Andy Lee. And this allows us to raise a lot more birds with a lot less labor. So we can do about 70,000 birds a year with 2 full-time employees out there.
How many did you do that many this year?
No, we're going to do about 50 this year.
50.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So that many birds, I got to wonder where you get them from and what you do with them when they're ready to leave. so, so
Right.
where do you want to start?
Well, start at the beginning. So we actually buy our chicks. Um, well, just for discretion's sake, I don't think it matters, but we end up buying them out of a one of the bigger chicken industries here, companies here in California. So we actually buy them kind of off the back dock. So if they didn't come to us, they would have gone off to a conventional house.
Okay, and that's fair. And I get why you don't want to like say where your source is. That's totally cool. I'm just, and the angle that I would go with that is if we have like if these hatcheries have big problems, it it seems to me like there's just not very many commercial hatcheries around. And if one or two of them has a problem, like that could really disrupt a large part of the chicken industry. Am I reading that right? Is that your feeling too?
So you're not wrong. It's hatcheries are reasonably plentiful, reasonably. What really is limiting is egg supply. So there are only two or three or four large fertile egg suppliers that ship out eggs to all these hatch. So, if you have a hatchery nearby, very likely that hatchery does not have its own breeding flock. It just buys in fertile eggs, puts them in the incubator, and hatches them out. So I know that there's two or three in California that do that. They just buy in fertile eggs, hatch out, and ship, which is totally fine. But it's so you feel like you have a lot of hatchery options, which may or may not be true in your area, but you probably don't have a lot of fertile egg options. I can't remember the name of the company, but there's one company out of like Alabama or Arkansas that ships 60-70% of the fertile eggs in the US for all the Cornish cross. So if you're really talking about trying to come up with a diversified, solid, decentralized chicken genetic situation, anything that has to do with the Cornish cross chicken, which is 99.8% of the country, you can't really do that in a backyard. That the amount of genetic line breeding and cross breeding and back breeding that goes on, it's insane. There's no way that a small scale person can do that. What you could do is you could go to one of the more heritage breed, which would be a dual purpose, like New Hampshire's or Rhode Island Reds or Delaware's or something like that. But then all of a sudden you're leaving behind a ton of performance, like weeks and weeks and weeks on your grow out, which
So
translates to dollars and dollars and dollars per pound when you're going to retail. So
those
is it better?
Cornish
Yeah, but
crosses,
no one's going to pay for it.
we've got a couple big white Cornish crosses in our little chicken flock. We have like 27, 20, 29 yard chickens, and they're all mixed up, crossbreed. Some have actually been raised from eggs, which I think is an important point because, like if there's one hatchery in the United States or one fertilized egg production place in the United States that's like half of the Cornish cross chickens on the commercial market, like the red flag people, like that's not great. So we're just like I'm trying to do with my cattle, trying to develop a breed that works in this environment. I've really been encouraging her to try to, keep back a rooster, keep back the good hens that are performing really well and that aren't always right up trying to get food at the front of the line that stay out and work. We've got some pretty decent chickens. We've got one that's red orange. He's a crossbreed mutant weirdo, but he makes really good. He's a good rooster.
Right.
I think he's 3.5, and the Cornish cross that we got as like, as a chick in the spring is twice his size now. Like,
Oh yeah.
but the Cornish cross, they're not as fast. I mean, he'll go out farther than the others sometimes, but he's big, fat, slow, and dopey. Like I'm just waiting to see a coyote come out of the brush and just snatch his ass and take him away. But Hasn't happened yet. Hopefully we'll get to put him in the freezer in a week or two.
Yep.
So that leads me to the other question. If you got 50,000 birds, I'd hope you're not doing all those in the kitchen. If you are, it probably takes more than a day.
No. We at that scale. So there's something under 20,000 birds. The USDA kicks that inspection down to the state level. Each state has their own levels of inspection. So you can process, depending on your state regulations, up to 20,000 birds on farm. But at over 20,000 birds, you have to be USDA no matter what. So we've been going to a USDA plant for the past 10 years, something like that. And yeah, we're knock on wood, we're kind of professional at it now. That mostly what you see guys doing is they'll have plastic crates, with the top open. You put your birds inside of it. I don't know if you've seen those. You see them pheasant guys will use these fairly often to carry pheasants around. Well, we've upgraded to what they call coops or modules, depending on your part of the country. And it's a 4 foot wide, 8 foot long by 5 foot tall metal cage that has 10 doors on it. Each one of those doors holds 25 to 30 birds, depending on weight and age. We've got a 6,000 pounds 4-wheel drive forklift, and we load that thing up, and then we stack it on a semi trailer, and we load up about 3,000 birds at a time and on our semi trailer and ship them on off down the road.
That's like 20 some truckloads of chickens.
Yeah, something like that.
That's a lot of chickens. That's a lot of biomass.
It is. Well, I mean, chicken. So I couldn't do the math quick enough, but your average, our harvest weight is about 6.5 pounds live weight when we harvest these birds. So 50,000. So that's 300,000 pounds of chicken live weight. So that's, say, a grass-fed steer is, to make the math easy, 1,000 pounds. So that's like a 300 steer a year grass-fed beef operation, which is not small, but it's not huge either. So when I say 50,000 chickens, people are like, oh my God, and they fall out of their chair. But when you kind of convert it over into cow numbers, you're like, yeah, it's decent, but it's not like a huge operation.
If people think 50,000 chickens is a lot. I mean,
well, yes,
compared to 29, 50,000 is a lot. But compared to what Tyson's already done this morning, and we're Monday, like it's noon on Monday.
Oh yeah, no.
Like, Tyson did 50,000 probably in the first half hour this morning.
Probably more. Yeah, 50,000. So a conventional barn, depending on the size, holds 20,000, 30,000 birds. Most conventional guys run 1 to 2 barns at least. So basically, and then they'll turn those barns over 4 times a year, I think. So, basically we are one half of one guy's barn in one turn. I mean, we're nothing. So it sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. There are a lot of benefits from having this much, because you import lots of fertility in the form of chicken feed that you turn into chicken manure. Like, there's all sorts of fun fertility stuff that's going on. So we're doing lots of cool stuff with this chicken. But so on, it's just kind of, it's what scale you rank it on. Like, on the impact we're having on our land, yeah, it's pretty awesome, pretty big. Are you ranking us on the production of like other pasture producers? Yeah, we're on the bigger side. Are you ranking us on any sort of scale of conventional operations? We're nothing. So our processor that we go to, they process 50,000 birds a week, and they are a pretty small scale operation where they do most things by hand. So that means that for a processing plant, kind of the minimum viable size of a processing plant, we are less than 1 week's worth of work for them. So another fun way of spinning that, which is where someone always goes to if you're in the direct marketing world, is like, well, processing, right? Processing is the bottleneck. How do you get them all killed? How do you get them turned into saleable product? Well, in California, we have two processing facilities. There's the one we go to, and there's one other one. There's a third, but it doesn't really work out. And so that there is a capacity there. Like when I was doing 70,000 birds a year, I basically maxed out our current processor, that they didn't have room for little people because I was bringing in a whole bunch of stuff for a whole bunch of birds for our client.
You're
So
bringing
then you
truckload every other week.
Truckload
every other week.
At that point, it was going to be a truckload a week. That was going to be, 3,000 birds a week, something like that. So anyways, you want to get into owning your own processing plant. Everyone always says this, on farm kills the way to go. And I'm not going to debate the whole like logistics of it or the economic realities of it, but just to know that to keep the doors open, you need to basically process, people are going to argue with this, 3,000 to 5,000 birds a day. So you need to be able to produce and sell 15,000 birds a week, kind of minimum, to open your own processing facility. So, let's call it 20,000 times 50 weeks. So you're looking at what, 1 million birds a year to open your own processing plant.
Yeah.
Just to keep the lights on. Right. And we're doing 50,000 birds. So there's another scale to drop this all onto, that, if you're really nothing unless you're doing 1 million birds a year.
Kind of like you're not a whole lot in the cattle business until you're doing 1,000, 15, 2,000 head.
Right.
I mean, well, even at that scale, so I think weekly cattle harvest is something like 640 to 660,000 head. So yeah, I guess until you have your own feedlot of about 100,000, you're kind of a small player in the beef industry. And puts it in perspective, guy with 120 cows or a guy with 50 cows, we're kind of a speck of dust, and it puts things in perspective.
Right. I mean, we're super important dust. I mean, not to like denigrate where we're at. I mean, we're very critical to the whole system, but it does kind of, and this also circles back a little bit to the economic incentives of cheap. You only get cheap by getting big, right? So that's kind of why everything's gotten big. So that's, to some degree, that's just how it's worked out. So we don't really want to get to necessarily be 1 million birds a year. That sounds like way too much work, but 50, 70,000 birds a year, direct to consumer, making people happy, sharing the good word about all the fun stuff we do. That's okay. That'll make a pretty solid living for me and my family.
Okay, so at 50,000 a year, that's your contract growing situation. Let's circle back to your direct marketing channel, direct to consumers. I get the impression you're trying to spin that back up and build that back up. Give me an idea of how many birds a year you think you could move through that pipeline and what your customer base is like.
I think, our last contract grower, we were growing on contract, was selling about 1,000 birds a week through their online site. So that's my entire market research there. I was raising the birds. I knew that they were selling about 1,000 of them a week through online. So boom, that's kind of to some degree why I picked the number. I want to do 50-ish thousand birds a year direct marketing, because I know someone who was doing it with my birds from right here in California, sold to mostly California consumers. So that's, and the market's only grown. I mean, the more you talk to people, I mean, the only sticking point to pasture poultry is that it's so expensive, because people don't expect chicken to be expensive, right? Chicken is cheap. Whether or not that's true, it's not. That's what people expect. So when you come to them with a chicken that is multiple times more expensive than what they are expecting, they're like, this is amazing, but I'm going to go get my Costco rotisserie for $3 and call it good.
Because they don't realize the externalized cost of cheap food.
Mm-hmm.
The like we talked about, the environmental cost, the social cost, the cost to the neighbors, and all done in corporate profit, which circles back to the cheap food argument. And we'll run away from that can of worms, but I've been thinking that there's just no system of economics that adequately addresses the labor and energy requirements of food production over the long term.
Well, you might be right. There's probably a reason why there has not been a long-term sustainable civilization yet.
All right. You got cows?
We do. Yep.
You said you do grass fed cows.
Yep.
So what's that like?
They're basically a hobby at this point. I mean, I grew up doing cow calf. That's kind of my spirit animal. You know, if people are always like, "Well, you must eat a lot of chicken." I'm like, I do, but if you give me a choice, I'm going with a steak. It's like, or wow, that many chickens, you must really love them. I'm like, cows are more interesting. They got personality. Luckily, the guys who take care of the chickens think I'm complete nuts, and they love our chickens, and they're always telling me the goofy stories that the chickens do, because you need to have that sort of relationship with your animals. So
Right.
it's they're they're better chicken people than I am, apparently. um, so yeah, no, the cows are good. I mean, so the ranch we're about 4,000 acres, which in this neck of the woods is about half size. We should, to be a true cow calf operation, we probably need about 10,000 acres of this sort of country. So we're always, part of the reason why we're doing all these weird things is because we've always been looking at how can we value add to the production here, that for whatever philosophical, ethical reason, we never went to rent more land. We never, because around here, a lot of people, we're in the valley. This is what they would call winter grazing ground. And then they ship their cattle up into the mountains, up into the Klamath Basin or up into the Sierras for summer grazing. We just never pursued that for whatever reason. It just wasn't something we chose to do. So it's always been, what can we produce here on these 4,000 acres, and especially when I came back from college, like, oh, well, now how do we make a ranch that can barely support one family support two? And that's where all this value added direct marketing stuff has been coming along. And that's one of the nice things about chickens, is that you're not actually limited to your land base, that you can actually buy in your outside input, right? You're buying in the grain. You can grow the chickens, so you're not really limited to your fertility. So that's one of the things that has been really great about chickens for us, is that we've been able to grow more chickens here than probably you would do than we could ever grow beef anyways. Right. So you've been able to, I'm not saying that very coherently, but we can grow more chickens than maybe we could ever grow beef. Yeah. Something like that.
I think that makes sense. I think chickens are a more efficient converter to begin with. Like, the chickens are kind of right up at the top of the efficiency scale for conversion of protein to pounds of meat. Not far below them is going to be, hogs, and then sheep and goats, and then kind of towards the other end is going to be cattle. And since they are such efficient converters, I start to the place that I kind of always end up in my mind is inputs. Always thinking about inputs. And man, last guy I talked to that was kind of in your neck of the woods, I think he's on the opposite side, like 2 hours the opposite way of Sacramento from you. He told me that 70 something percent of the corn that they need in California for animal production has to come over the mountains. And 50,000 chickens needs a lot of feed. But compared to, I don't know, Harris Ranch or just one feedlot, you use almost nothing. Are you concerned about the price and availability of grain for your chickens in the near future?
Yeah. I mean, it is our hugest input cost. I mean, for instance, so we are certified organic. We are also a no corn, no soy operation. So our feed cost has gone, we were at, plus or minus $600 a ton about well, probably 16 months ago now, and right now we're at about $1,000 a ton. So that shows up. That's a real number that shows up on the price I have to charge customers. Part of the reason why our wholesale hasn't been growing as fast as it could is because we're probably a buck 50 more expensive because of our feed price. So yeah, it's certainly something I'm worried about, and it is really the true Achilles heel to any sort of poultry operation, pastured or not, is that those are outside commodity prices. They're influenced by world events, the whole Crimea thing, Ukraine, and so if you look at if you and I don't have the numbers to prove it, but logically follow me down this rabbit trail here. If we internalize all those externalized chicken feed costs, so if we actually pay corn what it costs to grow it in the Midwest, if the soy cost is actually what it costs, if somehow we pay the chicken grower, the contract guy for Tyson or Purdue or whoever, a real living wage, we somehow account for the dead zone in Mexico. I don't know how you do all this stuff, but you account for all of that.
Don't forget soil erosion.
And soil erosion, right? Yeah, right. Yeah. On all the other ones I'm not even thinking of. Now you put all that into the feed, into the chicken cost. Do you really think chicken's going to cost $3 a pound or $2 a pound? There's no way. I don't know what it's going to be, but it's going to be way up there. Now you take that same sort of idea and you apply it to grass-fed beef, where you've got grass, you got sun, and you got cow. Yeah, there's some more, but I mean, that's pretty much it, more or less. So chicken actually is not a cheap protein. It's not. Chicken should not be cheap. The only reason it's cheap is because of the way the farm bill is set up, the way the economic system has been set up, and that really chicken, I don't know why, I can't remember why I went down this rabbit hole. Chicken should not be cheap. So one of the God, I really should figure out which president said this. One of his presidential slogans was "a chicken in every pot."
Hoover.
As in, like, hey, prosperity. If you have a chicken in your pot, everyone is happy, healthy, and wealthy.
Herbert Hoover.
Well, us modern people are like, well, chicken in a pot, big whoop. Well, the thing was, back when that slogan came into being, that not everyone had access to chicken. Chicken was a special thing. That chicken Sunday roast dinner was a big deal. That's why you had chicken on Sunday, because that was the crown jewel of the week of your dinners or your suppers, depending on your part of the country, right? And so when the president was promising a chicken in every pot, that was to some degree the beginning of this whole cheap chicken idea, that they took a very expensive, loved and expensive and loved protein and made it accessible to the masses. And everyone's like, oh, I can now eat, like, this is like getting caviar for free or whatever. It was a cheap way, or not a cheap way. It was a way of making people love the politicians and getting them reelected. So that's a little bit of a political conspiracy theory there, but to some degree, that is why chicken is cheap, is because 50 years ago, some president wanted to be elected again, and congressman and blah, 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 blah. So I'm not really a political conspiracist, but there's definitely some machinations going on behind the curtains to keep chicken at the price it is now, because it shouldn't be this cheap.
I would definitely agree that it shouldn't be anywhere near as cheap as it is in a grocery store. And I think our beef price has to come up too. And that was something I think you mentioned earlier was, where did I make that note? Valuing the beef correctly, I believe, is what you said. And, we're kind of talking about it with chicken about, these externalized costs. And if we all this accounting was done properly, what would the food really cost? No one knows. But I do think that it's kind of clear that we're not valuing our beef correctly. And the same is true for you in Northern California as it is for me here in the Plains. It's kind of difficult to sell grass-fed beef at the premium we think that we should be charging when the consumer's mind still has $1.99 ground beef in it from 2 years ago. And they don't understand that that same ground beef they paid 99 cents a pound for 2 years ago is now $4.99 a pound in the exact same meat case, in the exact same package. Like, and they're not getting that.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think there's going to be? Do you think that's going to change in the near future, that we're going to start maybe chipping away at some of that consumer perception that our premium isn't worth the price?
Oh, I I I I don't know about that. I mean, I guess I'm going to do a politician and not answer your question at all. I would say I acknowledge your question. I have no idea what the answer is. Let me tell you what I want to tell you.
Okay.
So what I'm going to say is that that's one of the reasons why we are pushing into this direct to consumer, is that to just be able to say, hey people, this is it, this is who we are, this is what we do, these are the costs, this is it, this is how much it costs for us to grow this meat for you. And that certainly not a take it or leave it, but believe it or not, that this is the thing. And that the whole industry standard of mass customer perception versus reality, and how to change that, and then you have all of the various third party things that wash through there of like, oh, we're country of origin labeling, although I think only us producers care about that, versus like, natural versus like free range, versus, it's so big and crazy and convoluted that I try and bring it back down to a one-on-one level. Like, how do I tell you, my consumer, what I am doing and why it matters? And that if you agree with me and you buy my meat, this is awesome. We have a great relationship going. If you think I'm great but can't afford it, that's still good. I at least have opened your mind to the reality that production is prices and cost of production are so out of sync that at some point something's going to crumble. I mean, I'm surprised it didn't crumble any harder than it did over COVID, but eventually these chickens are going to have to come home to roost. So not only did I do a politician answer, I don't even think I answered my own question.
It's okay. I probably do that a lot and I never get called out for it. Chickens coming home to roost. I like that turn of phrase. So how concerned about greenwashing are you of labels? Because you did say that you raise organic, non-GMO, no hormones, no antibiotics, and I'm asking that from the perspective because the other side, the production side, the animal science side that's relying on science and needles, they'll say, well, if it's 30 days post injection, there's no antibiotics in it because it all processes out of the body. Well, does antibiotic free mean there's shouldn't be any in the meat, or does it mean there's never been any in the meat? What do these things mean?
Yeah, greenwashing. I that's a quagmire, man. You're throwing me into the deep end here. So my personal answer is that this is why I try and talk to consumers and be like, I'm not greenwashing. I'm telling you, like, this is how it is. This is how I do it. For us, antibiotic free means I don't have any on the ranch. I couldn't give it to them if I wanted to. When you start going into grocery stores where you kind of are a hands-off situation, that greenwashing is obviously a problem. I mean, the whole term natural, I mean, what's the actual definition of natural? Minimally processed or something, minimally something, minimal ingredients, whatever. I mean, clearly that is absolutely meaningless, but they still get a premium for it. But on the other hand, that means they took a step better, right? So to some degree, I am a big fan of making many small steps in the right direction, being directionally correct. So, hey, this is my favorite example, organics. We're getting a lot of organic stuff from China.
Right.
Is that really organic? Probably not. But is that pseudo organic China or organic stuff from China? Is that better than the conventional stuff from China? Probably, right? I
Or does it
mean,
come out of
and
the same farm and they just paid off an inspector to look the other way while they stamped organic on it?
well, don't ruin my metaphor here, man.
Okay.
The idea is that the idea is that just if we can move in the right direction, that things get better. And that, like I said, that the chicken industry has reduced their antibiotic use by some large percentage. That's all consumer driven. And that's because some consumer was willing to pay 5 cents a pound more on a package that said antibiotic free or whatever the price was. Um, and they are shifting a multi-billion trillion dollar industry because the consumers don't want are worried about superbugs. And so the greenwashing is definitely there. You can see it happening even now. Pasture raised is starting to like get, nibbled at by some of these bigger companies that are trying to show up in the grocery store. It's like, I just don't see how a nationwide brand can be truly pasture raised. But so greenwashing is obviously an issue. But I think really, if you're seeing greenwashing, that means is the industry is trying to get ahead of a consumer trend, and that they want to kill it, they want to make money by it, but they see that the trend is happening, and so it's both kill it, and then I also see them by joining it. They like General Mills bought Epic bars a few years back, right? General Mills sees the trend of I don't know what that trend is, meat bars, organic meat bars, high-end regenerative meats. And they couldn't figure it out their own self. So they had to go buy someone, bring it into their system. They what?
They screwed it up.
Well, I don't know that they did. Yeah, I mean,
okay, that's my opinion. They screwed it up. Like I feel like the quality went down. I quit eating Epic bars and went to different products.
Well, I never ate them in the first place. But just, I guess my point being is that greenwashing is happening, but that these big companies are only greenwashing because they feel threatened. And that even if they have to greenwash the truth, they've at least had to take a small step in the right way. So if as consumers, this is another thing I like to say a fair amount, is that we choose our future every time we buy our food, right? This is how people get connected to the ground. You live in the city, you don't think you're connected to farming and agriculture, but you eat every single day, right? So if you buy something, you are sending a very clear market signal that I value this. And that if you say, hey, I bought a pasture raised chicken, you're saying I value this. Well, Purdue is going to pay attention to that and try and get ahead of that curve. And whether or not it's going to be 100% a true blue pasture raised bird, time will tell, but that it's more of a pasture raised bird than if they didn't see that market signal. So I'm not saying it's perfect. I just like the trending in the general direction. Drive consumer knowledge. Hey, pay attention to this. Vote with your dollars, and these big guys will eventually turn their course and follow us where we need to be.
The thing that's going to worry me is when like USDA comes out with a definition of what a pastured bird is, because like they'll eventually, if they do, they'll have to come out and say something like, well, a pastured bird means that it's never in confinement for more than this many hours a day. It's not not on a roof for this more than this many hours a day, that it's got a minimum of the whole pasture area is X square feet times Y birds.
Right. Yep.
And agriculture is very vast and varied. And out here in the Great Plains, my context, my soil, my forage production is on a totally different cycle than you are. You could even go 40 miles in any direction from this ranch, and that production system would change. Like the carrying capacity of the land would change. How many cows, how many chickens, how many sheep, how many goats, that balance, that ratio would change. And the danger that we have when organizations start making these top-down rules that are supposed to apply to everybody from Maine to Southern California, from Washington to Florida, it doesn't take into account, the extreme variation there is in productivity and potential of the land. And even if we break that down to, oh, well, that's why we have EPA regions. That's why we have resource concern areas. And it gets down to, I just feel like that the infinite complexity of trying to manage on the land for the health of the land can't be managed with top-down decisions without making significant sacrifices for the health. Does that make any sense?
Oh yeah, no, I agree. You're right. One size does not fit all, and I don't have an answer to it. I mean, I'm gonna say, hey, look, to my consumers, this is my answer.
No, you have the answer, and the answer is connecting with the consumers and
right.
being transparent, showing them what their numbers are. So, like, the next question I want to know is 50,000 birds a year direct to consumer. How many consumers is that roughly you figured you're going to need to connect with?
I'm saying 1,000 families. That my goal is to provide the protein for 1,000 families in the Bay Area.
Okay,
that's kind of our mission statement, customer demographic, whatchamacallit.
And that's, you figure that 50,000 chickens, I mean, 1,000 family, 50 chickens a family. I mean,
yeah, chicken a week.
Chicken a week. And, when you break down the pounds, it probably works out about right to average consumption.
Yep. I mean, it depends on the family, or, a growing family, or a a bunch of retirees, yada, 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 yada. But, 1,000. I mean, we can grow enough chicken for 1,000 families. And then, I want to get back into our small ruminant production. That this is the meat case you see in your store when you go to town is going to look pretty much exactly like the meat case I see here in California. But when we open the doors, pushing our cart out, like, you're going to have flat plains. I'm imagining, I don't know. I'm going to push out. I mean, like, oh, I've got, different. I have hills around here. I've got tree crops, we're different. So it doesn't make sense that your meat case is the same as my meat case. And that it, more specifically here in California, we're a Mediterranean climate. So we have cool, wet winters, hot, dry summers. So if you look at our production curve, we spike in the spring and tail off through the rest of the year. Now, if you look at a small ruminant production that spikes at pregnancy and then lactation, and then you can dry them off for a couple months, and then pregnancy starts all over again. So if you layer those two production cycles on top of each other, Mediterranean climate is perfect for small ruminants. That in California in the 1940s-ish, there were more sheep. Oh, got to get this right this time. I said it wrong in the last podcast and I got excoriated. There are, in the 1940s, there were more sheep in all, no, crap, no. There were a lot of sheep in 1940. There are no sheep now. And right now in Tehama County, my Tehama County, there are basically no sheep. And so that the old timers knew how to grow animals here. Like, well, this is great. We can grow amazing goats and sheep here. Like, we didn't really have buffalo here in California. Yeah, there were some. We had some big elk, but those also a grazer or a browser. And so it's kind of unnatural to have so many beef here in California. We really should have lots of goats and sheep. So the idea is that if we are truly trying to regenerate our landscape, to pump as much health back into our landscape, the animal tools that we should be using are goats and sheep. Goats and sheep are delicious, even though people don't eat enough of it. And that we have hills, you can't see it out because of the glare, but we are all sideways. We either flat or we're vertical, and we're all brush. We, on our 4,000 acres, we only have about 1,800 acres of good cattle ground, a couple thousand maybe. The rest of that 4,000 is, brushy crap that's great for goats. And that's not actually counting on all the up. And that's just a flat view. That doesn't even account for all the hillsides.
Right.
If you started accounting for the hillsides, we probably have, 6,000 acres that we could grow goats and sheep on. So the idea is that, and the California we're in a mega drought, and it's only going to get worse probably. And we're in a fire zone. It's only going to get worse. Well, what do goats and sheep eat? They eat brush. What's burning right now? Brush. What tastes really good to eat? Goats and sheep. Like, there is something really kind of fun and energizing about the idea of putting together the right balance of the right animals on the right landscape for the right reason, and then presenting them to consumers and be like, hey, people, by the choice of the food you make, you are going to create the environment that you want to live in. We are going to eat down all this brush so we don't burn. When the brush turns to grass, we're going to infiltrate more water. We're going to have more effective rainfall. We're going to have less drought. We're going to have less flooding, and it's all because of what you choose to eat. And so listen to me, because I'm a wacky guy with a beard, but buy our chicken, buy our goats, buy our sheep, buy some of our beef, and we'll save the world here in California.
You mentioned wildfires. Have you had any near you or affect you since you guys?
Yeah. Yep. We actually, the back 1,000 acres of the ranch burnt 3 years ago. Yeah. So that was the August complex. It was, at the time, it was the largest wildfire in California's history, which was 3 years ago. And I'm pretty sure every single year since then, we've had the next largest wildfire. So unfortunately, we were winning with the best fire that burnt the ranch down, but now we're only like third or fourth place.
I can share that exact feeling. 2016, March 22nd, 23rd, 24th, well, March 22nd through the 26th, the Anderson Creek wildfire ripped up out of Oklahoma, came up into my ranch, burnt the next ranch north, took a hard right turn, and went almost 20 miles to the east. And when it burned, it was the biggest one in Kansas history, like 340 some thousand acres. Pretty good size. And we thought, wow, that's the biggest fire that we've had in Kansas from a single source. That was bad. Hopefully we won't see that again in our lifetimes.
Right.
2017 was like, hold my beer. We had a little fire called the Starbuck Complex fire that was like 625,000 acres. And then in 2018, just south of me down into Oklahoma, they had some stuff down there that was just about downright biblical. I mean, so for all the listeners, everybody's going to have a different perspective on wildfire, right? From what you see on the news is a lot of times fires in the West, kind of out where you are, Tyler, Montana, Idaho, Colorado, where you've got these huge coniferous trees and big landscapes and lots of fire, lots of wind. The same stuff happens here on the Great Plains. It's just like our brush is smaller, our hills are smaller, but things are a lot more, things can move a lot faster. I mean,
right.
When a fire can outrun you in the grass and you're running 55 down the blacktop road, folks, this is a situation. Just like you guys have the eucalyptus trees and the big pines and the firs and whatnot that blow up and explode, we have eastern red cedar trees. And in some places, some pastures, they've been allowed to get out of control. And there's, 15, 20, 50% canopy cover, these massive trees. Well, it takes a big wildfire event to get in there and light them up. But when they do light up, you can see it on NASA sees it on the satellite from the huge heat plume that gets released, turns the sky black. It's just nasty. So where I'm going with this is after a fire, and it kind of almost doesn't matter the timing of fire anymore in my mind. Okay. What matters is what you do after the fire to manage the land after the fire, and when you choose to reintroduce grazing or browsing animals and whatever that looks like. Talk a little bit about your experience with fire, if you have any experience with prescribed fire, and how you managed recovery after the wildfire burnt that back 1,000 acres.
Right. So we are actually pretty active with, it's California Department of Forestry or something like that. Cal Fire. We work with them a fair amount. We do as much as we can, prescribes burns in the winter. I think things are changing, but it actually, you can't obviously do a control burn in the summer because no control possible. So you can only do control burns in the winter, and you can only do a control burn when the fuel load is dry, but the ground is wet. Well, those specific conditions actually happen a fair amount, but it only happens in a weather condition where all that smoke settles into the valley and then goes down into the city. So the Air Quality Control Board never lets these decent sized control burns happen because basically it'll smoke out the city. So that has actually been a huge issue that, any any real firefighter I've ever met has always been kind of like a back pocket pyro, and they want to burn, man. They want to burn.
So let me just make sure I have the situation captured. It's like the people are starting to figure out we need to burn these forests because we haven't managed them correctly to manage the fuel load. Yes, go prescribe burn. Cal Fire's like, yes, we need to do prescribed burning. Yes, we're going to do prescribed burning. The landowners are all like, yes, we see the benefits. We want to burn. The Air Resources Board is like, yes, we see the benefits, but we're not going to let you do it because those old people with asthma down the valley might not have a great day.
Yeah, I don't know what their reasoning is, but yeah.
Well, I mean, I totally get it. Like if we're gonna burn, I mean, fire's part of my culture too, and farther east in the Flint Hills where they have more of an issue because here when we burn in the Red Hills, we're so far away from population centers. Like, you know, we can burn an awful lot, not really risk of run any major smoke risk. Over in Flint Hills in eastern Kansas, if they do it on the wrong day, they're either going to smoke out Wichita, Emporia, Topeka, Salina, or Kansas City. It's one of them. Like somebody's getting smoked out the first week of April when the Flint Hills burns. That's just the way it is.
Right.
And to some extent, maybe that represents the difference in culture because the Flint Hills has always been like that. Like they've had a burning culture for decades. And even there, it's not enough. Like even in the Flint Hills, they're losing the battle against invasive herbaceous vegetation and brush and whatever. Um, but the people that are downwind of them have always been a little bit more accepting of the smoke. And there's been in the last 15 years since I've been aware of it, because my work with the Kansas Prescribed Fire Council and smoke management plans with the EPA. Oh gosh, that was 2008, 9, and 10. The EPA has been trying to work in Kansas to get them to, similar problems like you guys are having out there in California. Like, they recognize we have a right to burn, and it's a critical thing, to maintain certain kinds of pasture lands. It's a critical thing to prevent the spread of invasive brush and habitat loss. But at the same time, it's difficult because they have to balance the needs of the many downstream. And if we're not burning enough, I mean, it's clear, even with all the policies, even with everything that we've, made strides forward in the last couple of years about raising awareness of prescribed burning. Even here in my area, with as much as we've done in the last 10 years, it's not even 20% of what we actually needed to be doing. And we know that. But it's just so hard, that's another set of problems. And I imagine you guys are dealing with an entirely different set of problems when it comes to trying to get a prescribed burn off and finding just the right magic day with the right weather conditions and the right smoke management conditions to allow you to burn without affecting anybody else negatively. But then maybe the other side of the coin is, have we failed in reaching our consumers and letting them understand our challenges and the tools that we need, the tools and practices that we should be applying more?
Oh, I think the answer is absolutely yes. I mean, the only education that I know about as far as fire management, fuel management is Smokey the Bear. I mean, I can't think of anyone else, right? Like there's this whole propaganda system with the kid and the Smokey the Bear comes to the elementary school and, all that sort of stuff. And so I don't, I can't even think of anyone else who has a countervailing idea. It's like it's almost Smokey the Bear is the biggest problem than anything. So yeah, I don't know. There's got to be kind of some sort of not quite cultural, but some sort of like top down re-education process.
I think it might have been something I saw come out of Oklahoma, or maybe it was something I saw come out of Kansas, but from one of the Forest Service, and it was a redo of Smokey the Bear. And instead of, only you can stop a fire, only you can start a prescribed fire.
Nice.
And we even talked about like trying to get that on books and matches or get that on a lighter, but we didn't think that that Forestry Service would be too happy about us using the likeness of Smokey the Bear saying, hey, go start fires.
That would be pretty funny.
It's responsible use of fire. And I imagine to some extent Smokey Bear was kind of necessary. And maybe it did do a good job of saving the forest that now we've got to go fight the other way to protect, bring back the fire, try to restore the balance. Maybe it's just another example of a short-sighted government program with the best of intentions.
Oh, I think that's absolutely the case of, it seemed to have come into existence for a reason. But it was a knee-jerk reaction to a situation without real long-term, because to go down another rabbit trail, us humans, we're really terrible at long-term situations, right? We don't think in 100-year, 200, 300, 400-year cycles. We're like, what happened yesterday?
What's going
right? And I think that's to what's going to happen tomorrow. And that's kind of the problem with all these fuel managements, is that we just had a very short-sighted, like, let's, at least in our area, it was like, let's take care of the timber. We don't want the timber to burn down, so we can't have any wildfires at all. But no one really kind of started looking at, and I am not an expert by any means, so if there's any California fire expert listening to this, I'm sorry, I'm going to get this all wrong, but they talk about stems per acre, like how many trees per acre you should have, and that you can have, you could have 100 1-foot stems or 10-foot stems or something like that. So you're talking about the same stem area, just how it's divided up. Well, those 10-footers or whatever the right number is, like, they're going to be pretty actually fire resistant because their surface area to volume ratio does not lend itself to burn. But those little tiny ones, that's basically upright kindling. That's just asking to burn. And the only way you can get the 10-10 instead of the 100 ones is by basically burning it. You got to burn them when they're small, or graze them when they're small, or do something to them when they're small. And then only 10 out of those 100 survive. That you don't actually, we have, through our management, we have grown this fuel system. And so that's one thing. And then also, that the cover, you mentioned cover, 50, 60, 70% cover, that right here where I'm sitting, I'm about 10 miles north of a very minor trail that they used to trail sheep from the valley back up into the mountains for the summer, and then they would trail them back down in the winter. And that it's called Elkhorn Ridge, and that it used to have grass up there. It used to be a good summer pasture. Well, I don't go up there very much now, but you go up now and it's just a whole bunch of manzanita brush and, like, digger pine litter, a foot deep. You don't see soil. You certainly don't see grass. And it's all because of all these big ass trees and brushes that have just grown over and shaded out the ground. Right. And so what the old timers used to do is that they would graze their way up in the spring, and the last guy down and just drop his cigarette in a brush pile here, there, and he would burn his way back down the mountain. And then in the springtime, he'd go right back up and hit all those little burn spots because they were greening up fastest and earliest, and they would kind of put all the pressure on all the stuff growing back. And so that was the burn cycle. It was no big deal. And now, so they were going through what we call the chaparral belt, which is it's mostly comprised of a plant called chamise or greasewood, and it burns like poof.
With the name, and that's I would expect it to burn rather well.
Yeah, it's a fun fire. If you have any sort of pyro in you, this stuff is the stuff, because it's all on hillsides, right? So if you get a pile going at the bottom, just the convection, just like woof, you'll take off a whole 5-acre hillside in like 30 minutes. Just woof. Amazing. Sounds like a V8 engine. You can hear it from a half a mile away.
When did you say your burn season starts?
What the wildfire season or the control season?
Let me go check plane tickets. Either way, it sounds
Oh yeah, yeah.
like fun.
Well, unfortunately, we all burnt that, right? It's all done. The big fire already got it, so we're gonna have to come back in like another 10 years.
Uh,
Um, but it is a fun burn. Holy moly, flames like 15, 20 feet in the air, just like, oh, and then it hits a digger pine, and those things just like they'll Roman torches, like, it's both terrifying and mostly cool. It's like, that is a fire.
you get enough eastern red cedar trees in a small enough area, hit it with a hot enough fire, and you can put fire, a column of black smoke, solid black smoke, really high, and there'll be fire 150 feet up in the air, up in that
Right,
column.
right.
And you
It's
start back,
nuts.
you're a quarter mile away, and you start feeling the heat coming through the windshield, and you start backing up. Like maybe it's time to back up a little bit,
Yep,
another
yep.
quarter
That's the good
mile,
stuff.
maybe. Yeah, that's fun.
So, anyways, that I don't even remember, but that's kind of the idea to get back for us personally, goats and sheep, and using not so much control burn as much as we can, but just using their presence to stay on top of this brush. You're asking about reintroducing animals, and we don't have the goats and sheep right now. That's the problem in California, that most of these wildfires are happening in areas that are steep. Cows, I'm 1,000-pound cow. I'm a 1,500-pound cow. I'm lazy. I'm not walking up this, 90-degree slope. Goats and sheep are like, yes, please let me do that for fun. But we don't have the animals to do it. So right now it's just kind of growing back on its own, right? I don't have to worry about it. I can't get the cows back in there even if I wanted to. So the only animals I'm going to have to control that regrowth are goats and sheep. And I don't have a market for them. I could take them to the local auction yard, but I mean, why not just shoot myself in the foot and save the trip to the auction yard, right? I mean, I can do the same thing a lot cheaper. So, that is kind of the from a whole bunch of different ways of why I'm excited about goats and sheep, is because it's a market we can develop. It's appropriate to the landscape. It'll help us reduce our fuel risk. It'll help California reduce its fuel risk, and that the cultural legacy baggage of goats and sheep don't taste good is just wrong. It's just wrong. I'm sorry, but my grandfather, we are now old enough that we probably should be clarifying that our grandfathers had a really crappy time in World War II eating mutton. And mutton, yeah, I wouldn't want to eat mutton very often either. But mutton is a world of difference from lamb. And we just don't do mutton anymore. It's lamb. It's a whole different thing. Get over it, people. Your grandpa's dead.
I'm I'm coming around on the lamb. Like goat, ground up goat and chili. Yes, please.
Oh
I'm
yeah.
I'm here for it. I'm still out. We're still working on the whole lamb chop business. Like sometimes the smells just, if it smells like greasy lanolin,
Right.
totally out. I'm totally out. If it smells good, if it smells like meat, I'm probably in. But that's
Have you noticed any difference? Are those hair sheep or those wool sheep? Have you noticed, or
I don't
the
eat near enough of it to be able to have any kind of educated opinion on the taste difference between hair and not hair sheep, sir.
so the story that I always kind of tell, and it's probably not totally scientifically accurate, but that lanolin is produced by wool, and lanolin's the fluff flavor. So hair or wool sheep tend to produce more lanolin because they have more wool. And so that the hair sheep tend to be a much more mild flavor. You less often have that gamey lanolin flavor to it. So that's just kind of why I was asking. And also there's a age finishing thing, kind of like beef, right? If you have a stringy beef that you didn't finish right, they're going to tend to taste a little funkier because they don't have that nice fat cover. It's the same thing on your lamb. So even if you want them finished, you're like, oh, fat doesn't have too much flavor, but you actually want them on an increasing plane of nutrition with a good fat cover, and it actually drops the muttony off flavor. So
Okay.
random stuff.
I mean, it makes sense that a hair sheep would have less lanolin, a lower lanolin level in the body, or fewer of those glands than a wool type sheep would. Makes total sense. Total sense. So I kind of want to circle back to your cows a little bit. Um, Black on black, Black Angus?
No, no, no. No, um we're a complete smorgasbord. Basically we're red. We're a red cow, red Angus. The bulls we were buying from the Hatfields back in the day were Tarente based,
Okay.
which is well, I'm actually on a ranching podcast, and I'm going to say this, and I'm going to be just totally wrong, and people are going to throw rotten tomatoes at me. But the way I would explain it, I would say that the Tarentays were the Red Angus of France, which is totally wrong. I understand it's wrong, people. Don't send me hate mail, but it got it in the mind of other people.
Okay. I mean, and I can kind of see that. Like, it would be the parallel to what an Aberdeen Angus is, but came from France.
Right. Something like that. So we were yeah, so we're kind of a red white face operation. I think personal feeling, I read something in the Stockman Grass Farmer. Alan Nation wrote it probably 15 years ago, where he said that, and it makes sense to me. Do you like to wear a black t-shirt in the middle of summer? No. Take your infrared thermometer and you hit the height of your black cow and you hit the height of your red cow, and there's a huge difference. And that California, we're much more hot than we are cold. So a cow, you're better off to aim for a comfortable summer cow than a comfortable winter cow. And then so I've always been a proponent of red. My dad thinks I'm nuts about this, but I'm fine. I'm fine with being right. He can think I'm wrong. The other thing I remember reading is that the Angus had been bred black because of their region. They didn't have very much sunlight, and so that the whole idea was to make them black, and they capture as much sunlight, what little solar energy they had, to keep them as warm as possible. And that's why they are black from that area. And that when you bring that sort of genetics from a wet, cold climate and bring it out to us here in California, anywhere, we are not cold, we are not wet, or we are for about 6 weeks out of the year. It doesn't make sense. Like, we should be much more looking, I don't know, Mediterranean climates, like some sort of Italian breed, or I don't know what. But that's my philosophy on breeding, is to not black. Even everyone else around here runs Angus. Don't think like this is like some sort of red cow country. Everyone else runs Angus around here. Everyone thinks I'm nuts, but that's okay. I'm used to it.
Hey, you see the picture behind me? Mm-hmm. They're speckled, spotted, colored, and spotted, all kinds of horns, and look funny. But tell you what, this calf crop, the last two calf crops look just
right.
Beautiful, uniform. It's like there's 6 or 8 of them that kind of run around as a group and that kind of go out underneath the wiring, go ahead and creep graze. And it's really funny. Went out this morning, took them a bale of alfalfa. They're all just carbon copies of each other. It's pretty neat.
Right. So and like they say, they're all red under the hide anyway. So what does it really matter?
Yeah. Oh, that was a can of worms we were discussing on Discord the other day. We were talking about the CAB program.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that the guy that grades the carcasses into the CAB program never gets to see what the hide looked like. That's one of the primary things that passes beef into that's the main criteria, right? It's got to be black hided, no white on the belly in front of the navel. Well, if the guy grading it to pass it into the program sees it after it's peeled, how does he know what color it was?
Don't know. He must be very talented.
So I'll throw that out there. If you're out there in podcast land and you just heard me say that and you know the answer to that question, please write in, send it to me, redhillsrancher@gmail.com, or find me on social media. I'm really, really interested to know the answer to that question. Oh, how do you get your cows through the winter? Like, I'm assuming right now, kind of like me, you're on the downside of your forage cycle and your grass is mostly dormant. You're living on stockpile. So maybe walk me through a little bit of your forage chain through the not so great times of year.
Yeah. So we we've reduced our cow herd by quite a bit from what we used to be. So basically our own owned cows are basically hobby at this point. We've got about, what do we got? 15, 20 mother cows, and we keep back steers and heifers kind of on a very unprofessional level. I mean, we should have sold them all when we kind of really went into the chickens, but you can't sell your cows, man.
You couldn't not have cows, right?
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Yeah. It doesn't make sense to have them. It really doesn't make sense to have them, but you can't not have cows. That would just, so we actually are a winter grazing option for, we partner with a guy up in, well, it doesn't really matter. He's up in the northeast corner of the state. And then he'll ship down a couple truckloads for the winter grazing season. So basically we are just playing. So our personal cows, we kind of run them in the nooks and corners and the bottomlands, and then we save all the rangeland for his cows when he ships in. So basically it's just a brittle environment. So even though we actually have had decent fall rain, we're green right now, which is kind of fun. We just had a inch and a half of rain over the weekend, with actually a little bit of runoff, which is actually exciting. That means reservoirs are being filled. So when he shows up for the first couple of months, it's basically just metering out stockpiled. We've got, what do we have? 12 or 15 permanent paddocks, and then we'll split those up with some temporary fence depending on the season and what we've got where. And then when our forage starts turning on in March, we'll just start kind of rotating over into more of a fast growth, fast move idea. And we'll probably hit the ranch. So the 5 months that the cows are here, we'll probably hit each pasture maybe 3 times, once in the stockpile season and maybe once or twice in the green season, depending.
So kind of like about an average of a 3-day graze in between moves.
Yeah. I mean, our fields are wildly different in size because of our geography is all kind of funky. Sometimes when I see, nah, man, that's flat. Are you kidding me? You could put a fence wherever you want on that stuff.
Yeah, looks can be deceiving. It's not as flat as it looks. It's
I know.
The canyon so the canyon that's actually behind where the cows are over this ridge.
Yeah.
It runs for about 6,000 feet.
Well,
there's 2 places to get across it. Maybe, yeah, there's 2 places to cross it. One of them has a tree over it. So
right.
it'd be a little bit dicey to get around. And that's all the way at the north end, and all the way at the south end I can get across that canyon. But anywhere in between that 6,000 feet, you can't. And the sides of it, it's kind of a slot canyon that's cut into the gypsum. So it's 15 foot down on one side, 5 foot across on the bottom, and 25 feet up on the other side for quite a bit of its length.
Wow.
Yeah, that's why it's in a 98. It's like a 98 acre paddock. It's that canyon, and that's pretty much it.
Interesting. So you have to kind of like graze it in a circle, then, pretty much.
Oh, I mean, they just kind of get turned in there, and if they need to go from one end to the other, we'll just go move the mineral or the protein tubs and let them be in it for a few days and cycle them right back out.
Interesting.
I've got several places like that I feel like the paddock is just too big, but I can sit here for hours and hours and hours and design all the cool fences I want on Google Earth.
Right.
But at the end of the day, somebody's got to go out and build that. And if I can't find a way, like if I have to build a lot too much of it on foot where, it can't be gotten around, or I can't ride the fence, that's like asking for trouble later down the line.
Right.
And if we're going to build stuff that's going to last, we need to plan to maintain it. We need to plan for what's going to happen when it's at end of life of, replacement of that. So, then I get into the thing like, all right, do I want to get the skid steer out, or do I want to go rent a dozer so I can make some of this access? Well, as soon as I pull that root out of the ground, as soon as we bear off that soil,
mm-hmm.
it's eroding.
Right.
Like, they shut down the reason this ranch exists and is still native range, what I like to call old growth grassland, which has never seen the plow. I've got, you know, over 90% of the ranch is old growth grassland, never seen a plow. Well, it never saw a plow because it's not flat enough to pull a plow through. Like they just couldn't figure out how to farm on more than about a 5-degree slope. And I'm kind of grateful of that because my whole ranch didn't get turned into a damn wheat farm.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of places that have just limited on how small I can get it by not being able to get across because they don't, you know, they didn't farm it because it'll erode. I mean, as soon as you take that soil cover off, take those roots out of the ground, there's some soil types that I have not been able to successfully get stuff to grow in 5, 6, 7 years down the line.
Right.
And there's some of it that, there'll be a place 50 yards away from that. I'll go and, tear up some dirt and think, well, I don't, whatever, don't care about this. If it ever grows again, I never drive by here. Well, then it'll grow, big blue stem and Indian grass 8 feet tall. And I'll wonder why it did it over there.
Right.
But not
Right.
where I really wanted it to, that I have to look at all the time. So I get really hesitant about going into some of these steep areas with machinery to make access because I've done it and I know what it looks like and what it's like to live with long term. So I don't have any answers, and I'll just say that it is a challenge for it. It's a challenge to try to continue to figure out how to find those efficiencies and how to maybe we can run a fence across here and saw this paddock in half. Okay, what's that get me? Well, that gets me another 3 days on my grazing plan, or that's another 5 animal units that I can run because I get 3 more grazing days because I got another move out of it. It gets difficult to start finding those efficiencies when you're like, well, I could build that fence there, but that's 2 days with the skid steer to go make that crossing, and then every 5 years I'm gonna have to go back and rebuild that.
Right.
Do that 20 more times on the ranch. Like there's a point where it's just kind of almost diminishing returns on building more fences, I think.
Have you it just kind of floated across my radar screen these days. There's a couple of these virtual fencing companies where they basically are putting little shock collars on cows and GPSs, and one of them's called No Fence, and I found another one called Vents, which is kind of funny.
Yep.
I don't know. I'm all excited about it. I have no idea if it's actually going to work. I'm excited about the concept because one of the holdbacks to getting goats and sheep out here is that they're going to go up these hillsides. I don't want to climb 1,000-foot, hillside to go bring them down. And yeah, dogs and all that sort of stuff. There's a ways around it. But, if you could like program in with the collars, like, hey, I want the fence to be here and they can graze this band to the hillside and they can do that band tomorrow. And, then you don't have to build fence. You just, play with your computer on your app on your phone. It's like, I like that idea.
So this is another one of those cans of worms. It's a wonderful subject. So if technology can make my life easier, more efficient, make raising cattle more efficient, easier for me to do, I'm here for it. Okay. I Yeah, no fence is cool, Vince is cool. And then there's some tags that aren't necessarily a shot collar that are just more of a monitoring location tag. They're kind of like a Fitbit for cows, which is really cool too. And almost every one of them that's on the market. And so we can talk about like a tag like Sirius or 701X, which is just basically like the Fitbit, the monitoring tag. Or we can talk about a system like No Fence or Vents, which is an actual shock collar that has an audio alert. So we developed, let me back up a step. We lost a lot of our animal husbandry and herding skills um, over the last 100 years. Okay. They still know these things in Africa, like the Maasai tribe and the Nguni tribe. Some of these tribes in Africa that they herd their cows around, and they have intrinsically understood the principles of holistic management. Alan Savory shows up and shows them how to do it on the map, and they're like, "Yeah, we do this anyway." Um, they still know how to herd their animals and operate them as a herd and live in harmony with them. We culturally lost that when we started putting up barbed wire fences. Okay. And I think a lot of the rodeo Western culture that grew out of the 50s and 60s, I don't think that helped stockmanship a damn bit. So we invented barbed wire and we fenced off the range to keep our cattle home because this is my place and these are my cows. And by God, my cows got to stay on my place. And then we invented polywire. And to some extent, polywire and good hot fence chargers kind of replace herding. And the way I make that make sense is like in an ultra high density grazing situation where you're moving them every day, you're moving a piece of polywire every day. And the analog to that is versus having two or three guys take turns working with the cattle in a herd, keeping them in a certain spot to create herd impact in a specific spot. We're just going to put a piece of polywire around that, put our cows inside the polywire until they do their thing. So in that analog, the polywire is basically replacing the physical skill, the physical labor of the herders. We can also talk a little bit about, the contrast to this all is what Bob Kinford likes to talk about when he talks about instinctive migrational grazing, which is some stockmanship techniques and movement patterns that help reduce stress in the livestock and help encourage the cattle to adopt a more natural grazing pattern without induced handler stress, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. I can hook you up with Bob and we can have a great conversation about this. Like there's a future episode with Bob Kinford coming pretty soon. I think I just feel it building. So going on this line of thought. So now, the first tier of technology is going to be that polywire and geared reels and Cyclops chargers that everybody loves. Then we get past that, the next step up the technology tree that we want to have, on replacing the herder and the instinctual knowledge of a herder. Well, now we've got things like vents and no fence, which provide feedback to the animal, which is the same thing that the polywire is doing, the same thing that the Maasai herders are doing. They're providing instant feedback to the animal to keep it in the location. Okay, that's cool. That's great. Contrast that with like a 70X or a series tag, which is just giving you back information about the animal, what state it's in, where it is, if it's eating, drinking, resting, and where it's been, right? And all this information is useful. And I could definitely see use cases for all four of these pieces of technology. But let's just go back to talking about vents and no fence. The really big use case I see for them is not necessarily for cattle, wouldn't necessarily be on a ranch like mine, because I can pretty much get across it. I can fence down with polywire to a smaller area and a tighter stock density than would be within the feasibility of the collar to control, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Because when your stock density gets high, they're always close to a boundary, so they're going to be getting alerts more often, which is going to be more draining to the battery. So the use case that I really see for these series and these vents collars is somebody between you and me that's got some valley land for maybe some winter grazing and has mountain leases or mountain ground. So when you go up to the mountain in the spring, you put the collars on, you program in, you have all their boundaries programmed in, and every day in the morning, you just whip out your smartphone or you get on your computer, you do your check-in with all the collars or all the tags, and you see where everybody is, right? I can see it being like there's a very, very strong use case for it on public land, on mixed herds, when you want to control those animals and exclude them from certain areas, but you're dealing with a vast landscape instead of, trying to tighten them down and control stock density at, above 25,000 pounds per acre. Right. Mm-hmm. So I can definitely see a use case scenario for somebody in that situation. And probably even for you, if you have a lot of terrain that gets to be inhospitable to travel through, there's definitely a use case scenario, because that, these collars would allow you to have those animals up there and being managed up there with a lot more resolution and granularity than would be possible with polywire. And to train a herder to do that job, like would it be possible to do it with a herder on foot with a dog? 100%. But that herd, and the difference is going to be, whereas let's say you've got a couple hundred sheep up in the mountains with collars or tags on them that are moving them around or excluding them for areas. The limitation to that is still it's technology. You're limited on what you can see on your screen and how many times you're going to go out and observe the animals to see how they're doing, like how what percentage of the forage they're eating in the paddock they're in. So my point is it a good tool? Yes. Are there use cases for these technologies? 100% yes. But we can't view them as a complete replacement for removing boots on the ground, eyes on the livestock management on a daily basis. Because if we're not out there, observing what our livestock are doing and getting the actual feedback from them that can only come with your presence where your livestock are and on the land, I think we're going to end up missing a lot of targets. And we're gonna start maybe missing some key benchmarks that we need to be looking for again. And we just say, well, that's just a sacrifice we're going to make in the name of efficiency or because of economies of scale. So I think 701X tags are cool as hell. I think Vince collars are cool. I think that the cost structure where they're at, I think some of them are way too expensive, even for cows. And I think some of them, um, the difficulty is the technology and the return value per unit, right? Well, of course, we make more per unit of cow than we make per unit of sheep, than we make per unit of chicken. But then it becomes a turnover. Okay. You got to do 50,000 chickens to do what 300 cows a year do, right? And imagine the sheep and goat numbers somewhere in the middle. So then we start to be, if we're talking about putting a piece of technology on an animal, now that technology comes at a cost. It always comes at a cost. And where I get to is the economics of it. Is it economical to put one of those things on a cow? It's easier to make that economic case. But when you're talking about a unit that costs, 15 or 20 or $100 for the tag or for the collar, does it become economical to put them on sheep or goats? Because you have a much lower return per unit on a small ruminant than you do a cow. There's faster turnover. But I just don't, it's hard for me to see on the published cost of any of these companies. It's hard to make an economic use case scenario on sheep or goats just because of the high cost and the low margins on sheep and goats. So, like, I totally get where you're at, man. And I think that there's some fantastic potential applications for that technology. But the cost of it and the cost of that technology, like, to apply to a small ruminant, that's going to be a big challenge. So the whole other side of the coin for me for these smart tags or smart collars is you ever play Civilization on a computer? You ever play that computer game?
I'm not enough. I know what it is, but no, never played it.
Okay. If anybody out there plays games or anything like that, like when you're playing these big simulation games, there's a technology tree that you have to unlock. Okay, you start at the bottom, like one of the first things to unlock is a granary, and then you unlock a library, and and as you go through the game, you get the ability to build these structures, which unlocks other things. And you don't have microchips without refining. You don't have refining without mining. You don't have mining without, certain types of tools. So in order to make a microchip and a battery energy dense enough that communicates with a satellite in outer space to determine its location on the surface of the Earth within 5 feet in real time. It's a pretty simple thing that we're all very used to by now because we carry around a supercomputer in our pockets. And we can ask this stupid thing any question we want, and it'll give us a pretty good answer. We can tell it we want to go anywhere, and it'll give us the best route, the shortest route, and the most fuel efficient route. But it's a piece of technology. And if we want to build all this technology that requires a fully unlocked technology tree to replace what any human being can do from birth and say we're making progress, it's a little difficult for me to get there. Because really, at the end of the day, that's what we're doing. Okay. Mm-hmm. We're going to put these collars or these ear tags on cattle. Why? So we can control where they're at. We can check on their health. We can see how they're doing. We know where they're supposed to be. We can move them around. Great. That's a herder's job. Like you just described a Peruvian herder and a border collie to me. So and that's where we're getting to. And I think earlier I made a comment about labor economics of food. And this is another part of that equation, the labor economics of food. So have we gotten to the point where this technology is so heavily subsidized and energy is just so ridiculously cheap that we are doing things like using microchips and satellite GPS to replace what a human being should be able to do with a minimal amount of training? I don't know. You asked about it. That's my take on it.
No, it was great. I get very enamored of like the tech solutions. It's always fun to think about. But I think at the very end, though, that was an interesting point you were bringing up, is that to some degree, part of my interest in vents or no fence or whatever is that it is not easy to hire in a skilled herder. I mean, you certainly don't go into town and put a job listing on the farm store board. Hey, need a herdsman. So that skill doesn't exist culturally, like you were just saying.
It's a high talking about Peruvians, if you can afford. It's a high skilled job. If you find the person that's got the high enough skills, you can't afford them. And if you find the person you can't afford for the price that you're offering, they're not skilled enough to do the job.
Right. So that's and that's happening all through agriculture, right? That's California, we have a huge migrant worker population that comes through and picks all of the grapes and the tomatoes and the strawberries and all that sort of stuff. And they're not coming anymore, not let alone policies, border control policies, but just that they don't come here anymore. So that there's a huge shift in agriculture away from manual labor towards some sort of roboticized, mechanized, digitized. Like it seems like that is the wave of the future. So I agree. I think it's much cooler idea to have Miguel out there with the border collie, grazing the sheep around, but that's finding Miguel or pick a name. Like, how do you find him? How do you train him? How do you keep him fully employed? As it becomes the labor issue becomes interesting. And I think that is happening to not just us specifically in my crazy goat and sheep idea, but that to all of us in agriculture, no matter where you are. Who's gonna change the pivots out there in the plains around you, right? I mean, if you have any water left. But other than that, right? I mean, that also gets into this whole corporate thing you asked about earlier, that you get bigger and then you can kind of afford all this mechanized stuff. And I don't know. Now I'm just rambling, but I think my one little question about the really cool electronic fence stuff, like, can immediately dives into this almost existential crisis that agriculture is entering into, because we talked about in our pre-interview that the demographics, right? That the oldest generation is now the biggest, right? Basically, every generation is getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
Yep.
So, I mean, just on a very huge, high level population level, that the workers are not, they do not physically exist, let alone are they in your neighborhood. They just don't exist in the population in general. So, who the hell is going to do all of this work? Because those older mouths still need to eat, at least for a few more decades. But there's no one left to grow the food for them, and at least and take care of them, and out of this, and support the tax base, and yeah, and that's just a whole nother can of worms that you like to open, right?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting moving through the next 10 or 15, 20 years in agriculture and seeing what happens with, let's just face it, a lot of the current producers aging out, because it's going to happen. I mean, it's going to happen to you, it's going to happen to me, and hopefully it won't happen to us for the next 20 years, but
Right.
we'll get to see the one of the current generations go ahead and age out and see how that shakes out. It's it's going to be interesting, and I think that we have, as a society, in the next 15 to 20 years, that there's going to be some interesting things happen. I'm not even going to say interesting decisions that are going to have to be made. I'm just going to say there's going to be some interesting things that we're going to have to choose to what we're going to prioritize. Are we going to prioritize cheap food, or are we going to prioritize the health of the land? Are we going to put people to work, or is everybody going to have a universal wage and we're going to rely on environmentally destructive technological solutions to sustain us? Are we going to try to put more people back on the land, or are we going to convert everything to corporate farming? I think that the challenges in the labor economics of food production, and we're seeing like the big crunch has come in the last couple of years with all the money that's been printed for whatever reason. Inflation of the money supply means that everything has to go up eventually, and when everything goes up but the price of food, that means there's going to be less people that grow, a less diverse mix of people that grow the food, because marginal operations get pushed out, and it's tough. It's going to be tough, and I I still feel like the best advice that I could give anybody would be to keep working to shorten your supply lines, reduce your inputs as much as possible, and get as close to your consumer and your customer as possible. We talk about, how do we make sure our labels aren't getting greenwashed? Well, the way around that is shake the hand that feeds you, connect directly with your producer. And if you're a consumer, well, that is if you're a consumer. If you're a producer, try to connect directly with your consumers. And that's why I question, how many consumers do you need to consume 50,000 chickens a year? Well, 1,000. That's not that many. That's a totally doable number. So we got to wrap up, because I'm sure you got work to do and I got work to do. So where can we find you on the inner tubes, Mr. Tyler?
Yeah, bigbluffranch.com. Pretty simple. You can find me there. My email should be up there. If it's not, it's tyler@bigbluffranch.com. I like talking about this stuff. If anything I said was unclear, which is entirely possible, and you want me to clarify it, just shout at me and I will make some rationalize my answers so it actually makes sense in the real world.
Hey, good stuff. I don't get that much hate mail, so I don't imagine you will either.
Yeah, maybe the beards are too intimidating.
Hey, if that's what it is, that's why I don't shave.
Yep.
All right, next time you're gonna have to tell me why you like peanut butter on hamburgers. Sorry we didn't.
Oh, you're right.
Hey.
Definitely part two. There you go. Teaser.
Yeah, yeah. All right. We're going to get out of here. Gang, y'all have a great week. Tyler, thank you, sir.